The night began like any other at La Renaissance, Manhattan's crown jewel of fine dining. Crystal chandeliers glimmered above white tablecloths, the murmur of laughter and silver cutlery blending into an atmosphere of wealth and exclusivity. No one inside expected that, within moments, the elegance would shatter. The heavy click of a lock echoed across the marble floor. 4 men in maintenance uniforms had just bolted the front doors. Their faces were rough, their movements sharp, and the tension in their eyes left no room for doubt. This wasn't about repairs. Quiet. Phones on the table. Now. The command cut through the air like a blade. At the corner booth, Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford Industries and one of America's most powerful billionaires, felt the cold press of steel against her back. A gun barrel. Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to stay still. "You're going to transfer $50 million to us right now," hissed the scar-faced leader. "Or we start dropping your rich friends one by one." Not far away, at a simple table meant for one, a 15-year-old black boy chewed calmly on his hamburger. His uniform shirt was neatly tucked, his backpack slouched at his feet, but what stood out most was his complete lack of fear. "Hey kid," one robber barked, aiming his weapon at the boy's phone. "You deaf? Put it down." The boy raised his head slowly. His name was Daniel Reeves. His expression was steady, unnervingly so. It wasn't bravado nor ignorance, it was as if chaos were an ordinary event. "I heard you," he answered, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "I was finishing my food. My dad always told me wasting a meal is disrespectful to people who don't have any." That single mention of his father sparked something in his eyes, a flicker of grief buried under iron discipline. Just 3 months earlier, his father, General Marcus Reeves, had died under what officials called a heart attack. Daniel knew better. The general had uncovered a dangerous corruption ring, and the cost was his life. Memories came in flashes. His father's voice, deep and steady, teaching strategy in their backyard. "Observe everything, Daniel. Notice the exits, the terrain, the weak points. Never overlook the obvious." Daniel's gaze drifted subtly across the restaurant. The robbers thought they had control, but he was already calculating. "What a comedian," the scar-faced leader sneered, stepping closer. "Let's see if you're still funny when." "You've got about 4 minutes and 37 seconds before police arrive," Daniel cut in, his voice calm as ever. The leader froze. "What did you say?" Daniel tilted his head. "Silent alarm triggered when you forced the door." The manager tapped his watch 3 times. "That's a panic code. Standard procedure. I read about it in security manuals my father brought home." The room fell silent for a beat. Then the leader let out a harsh laugh. "So we've got ourselves a little genius. Cute. Transfer the money now," he barked at Victoria, "or this kid's brains hit the tablecloth." Victoria's hands shook as she reached for her phone. For the briefest moment, her eyes met Daniel's. He blinked once, deliberate, controlled. Then he shifted his gaze from the chandelier above the robbers to the fire extinguisher on the wall, then back to her. It wasn't random. It was code. Victoria had built her empire by reading signals others missed. She suddenly knew this boy wasn't just a victim. He was calculating, prepared, fearless. "I'll need my digital reader to complete the transfer," she said, her tone firmer than before. "It's in my bag." Slowly, the leader ordered, stepping back. That was the moment Daniel struck. With surgical precision, he kicked the leg of his table. A plate of hot food flew straight into the leader's face. The man screamed, blinded by scalding sauce. In the same breath, Daniel hurled his chair at the chandelier overhead. Crystal and glass rained down, sending shards across the floor and breaking the robber's rhythm. "Back door. Now!" Daniel shouted at Victoria. She didn't hesitate. Panic broke loose among the diners. Robbers waved their guns wildly, trying to regain control, but they suddenly had no clear targets. One fired into the ceiling, a desperate attempt to restore fear. Daniel was already moving again. He yanked the fire extinguisher off the wall and blasted foam straight into another robber's face. The man coughed and staggered, blinded. "Damn kid," another attacker roared, charging forward. But Daniel didn't move like an ordinary teenager. Every block, every strike was exact, drilled into him by years of informal training with his father. A quick twist, a sharp counter, and the man dropped to his knees, his arm wrenched out of position. "You chose the wrong restaurant," Daniel said, voice still steady. "And you picked the worst possible person to threaten." The scar-faced leader, still wiping sauce from his eyes, finally looked at Daniel clearly. He saw it now, the posture, the discipline, the utter lack of hesitation. It wasn't luck. It was training. "Who are you?" he stammered. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, his ears caught the faint sound of sirens outside. His estimate had been nearly perfect. 4 minutes, 40 seconds. Victoria, standing near the kitchen doors now, could only stare. What she had just witnessed wasn't luck or instinct. This boy had defused what could have been a bloodbath. 3 minutes, Daniel called out, glancing at an imaginary watch. "Drop your weapons before my colleagues arrive." "Colleagues?" The leader mocked, but the crack in his voice betrayed uncertainty. Daniel smiled faintly, not with teenage bravado but with a sharpness far older. "My father was General Marcus Reeves, head of the 5th Special Operations Division. He may be gone, but his men still watch over his family. And they don't take kindly to threats against the general's son." As if on cue, the kitchen door opened. 3 men stepped out, tall, broad, their posture unmistakably military despite civilian clothes. They moved without wasted motion, silently surrounding the attackers. "Drop your weapons. Hands on your heads," one ordered, his tone leaving no room for defiance. The robbers faltered, then obeyed, realizing far too late how badly they'd miscalculated. Daniel walked back to his table and slung his backpack over his shoulder. For a split second, Victoria glimpsed inside: classified documents, surveillance photos, a notebook marked Operation Cleanup. This wasn't coincidence. "Sorry for interrupting your dinner, Ms. Ashford," Daniel said politely, as though he hadn't just dismantled an armed robbery. "Once the police finish here, we need to talk. About Defcon Industries." Victoria's blood ran cold. Defcon. The very defense contractor her shell companies secretly tied her fortune to, and the same one General Reeves had been investigating before his death. Daniel paused at the doorway, glancing back one last time. "Oh, and don't bother trying to run. We've got people at every exit in this city. My father taught me to always have a plan B, and C, and D. Minnie Hook, if you thought this was just a heroic teenager saving lives, think again." What Daniel Reeves revealed next would shake the foundations of power itself. 3 hours later, the chaos of La Renaissance had faded into the heavy stillness of the police station. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the stale air carrying the scent of burnt coffee and paper. Victoria Ashford sat at a desk, signing the last pages of her statement with hands that still trembled slightly. Detective Reynolds, a broad man with tired eyes, closed the folder with a sigh of relief. "Ms. Ashford, you were lucky that boy was in there. 15 years old, and he handled it like a trained operative." Victoria forced a smile, but inside, her mind was running faster than it ever had in a boardroom. Lucky? No. That boy wasn't chance. He was something calculated. Dangerous. When she exited through the back door of the precinct, her limousine was waiting. So was James Peterson, her trusted attorney. He opened the door as she slid inside, the leather seat swallowing her whole. "I need everything on Daniel Reeves," she ordered sharply. "His father, his mother, his school, his medical history. Everything. I want to know the brand of toothpaste he uses." James handed her a tablet, his tone steady but his eyes uneasy. "I've already started. His father was General Marcus Reeves, who died 3 months ago. Cause of death listed as a massive heart attack. But here's where it gets interesting." Victoria leaned forward. "Go on." The general was the Pentagon's internal audit director. He was investigating irregular military contracts. And his last case was focused on— James paused, his voice dropping. "Defcon Industries." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Defcon Industries. A leading supplier of military technology. Few knew the truth. Through a web of shell corporations, she was its largest individual shareholder. The boy's words echoed back. "We need to talk about Defcon Industries." "He knows," she whispered. James adjusted his glasses nervously. Victoria, if the general uncovered inflated contracts, unauthorized weapons testing, or payoffs to senators. Not another word, she cut him off sharply, glancing at the driver. Her pulse quickened, but it was too late for silence. Her phone buzzed in her lap. The message came from an unlisted number. Hello, Ms. Ashford. Thank you for not mentioning our agreement to the police. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Coffee Corner on 5th Avenue. We need to talk about the future of DEF CON. Victoria's skin prickled. How did he have her private number? Her fingers trembled as she typed back. I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not threatened by children. The reply came instantly, neither was my father. 72 hours after confronting you about the $840 million hidden in phantom equipment maintenance, he was dead. Coincidences can be fascinating, don't you think? Victoria's chest tightened. 840 million. That number was buried inside encrypted safes, accessible only to her inner circle. He shouldn't know that. He can't know that, she thought, deleting the message with shaking hands. It's nothing, she muttered aloud. He's just a traumatized teenager looking for someone to blame. But even as she said it, her mind raced through the possibilities. If Daniel had proof, and clearly he did, her empire wasn't just at risk. It was on the verge of collapse. The next day at 2:45 p.m., Victoria sat inside Coffee Corner on 5th Avenue, hidden behind dark sunglasses and a scarf. She wasn't worried about paparazzi. This was about survival. At exactly 3 o'clock, Daniel Reeves walked in. Same scuffed sneakers, same wrinkled school uniform, same worn backpack. To any outsider, he was just another student grabbing a drink after class. But his eyes, those eyes didn't belong to a boy. They were sharp, cold, and calculating. He slid into the seat across from her without invitation and ordered a hot chocolate. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if this were just a study session. You know, Daniel began conversationally, stirring his drink with a straw, my dad used to take me fishing every Sunday. He said patience was a strategist's best weapon. Wait for the fish to think it's in control, then strike. Victoria's jaw tightened. She said nothing. Daniel continued smoothly, my father spent 3 years investigating you. He created 47 false identities to infiltrate your shell companies. He tracked money across 12 tax havens. He recorded 89 hours of compromising conversations. Victoria's voice cracked as she forced out, I don't know what you're talking about. Daniel smiled. Not the smile of a boy but of a predator. Of course you do. That's why you arranged my father's heart attack. You have no proof. Daniel leaned forward. A private autopsy found digitalis in his blood. It mimics a sudden heart attack, almost impossible to detect, unless you know exactly what to look for. He slid a thin folder across the table. This is a copy. Originals are in 17 different secure locations. Victoria hesitated, then opened it. Her stomach dropped. Toxicology reports. Photographs from the autopsy. Documentation she thought had been buried forever. Her voice wavered. What do you want? Daniel's tone was simple, flat. Justice. My father gave 30 years to this country. He was killed because you were pocketing billions while soldiers died with defective equipment. Victoria's composure flickered back. You're a minor. This evidence won't stand in court. I have unlimited resources, lawyers who will bury you in paperwork until you break. You're right, Daniel interrupted calmly. Court would be messy. That's why I won't use the courts. He opened his laptop and spun it toward her. On the screen, the homepage of an investigative blog with millions of followers. At the top was the name Kenneth Morrison, Pulitzer Prize winner, former Marine, and one of General Reeves's closest allies. One word from me and tomorrow morning 12 million people read the headline, The Billionaire Who Killed a General. Victoria's hands trembled. You can't prove I ordered it. Daniel shrugged. I don't need to prove it in court. All I need is enough suspicion. Media uproar. Federal investigations. Stock prices plummeting. Shareholders fleeing. In 72 hours, everything you built will be rubble. Mini hook. Victoria had faced rivals, regulators, and political enemies. But never had she felt so cornered. For the first time in decades, she realized money couldn't buy her way out. Victoria's throat was dry. "So, what do you want from me?" Daniel's voice took on a teacher's clarity. "You're going to transfer 51% of DEFCON shares to a veterans fund run by my father's men. You'll resign publicly from the board, citing ethical differences." Her lips trembled. "That's extortion." "No," Daniel said, standing, tossing $5 on the table for his hot chocolate. "That's restitution. You have 48 hours. Fail and the world learns everything." He picked up his backpack. As he turned to leave, Victoria finally found her voice. How did a 15-year-old boy do all this?" Daniel paused, his eyes hard. "My father started training me when I was 6. Military strategy, cryptography, computer forensics. He knew he was fighting dangerous people. He knew one day he might not be there to protect me. So he turned me into his weapon." For the first time, Victoria saw a crack in his armor, a single tear sliding down his cheek. But his voice stayed sharp. "You didn't just kill my father, Ms. Ashford. You created the very thing that will destroy you." He walked out, disappearing into the crowd, leaving her alone with the crushing realization that every empire she built was now balanced on the will of a 15-year-old boy. Minnie Hook. Victoria thought she was meeting a grieving child. What she faced instead was the living legacy of a general, and the first move in a war she wasn't prepared for. Victoria Ashford didn't get to the top of America's corporate world by sitting idle. 2 hours after leaving Coffee Corner, she was already on the phone, mobilizing every resource at her disposal. "Find out where the boy is hiding the evidence," she ordered her head of security. "Erase it." Quietly. She brought in her best people: a private investigator who once worked for the FBI, 3 attorneys who specialized in burying scandals, and even a hacker paid to break into encrypted safes. "He's 15, she reminded herself, pacing her office. "No resources. No real allies. He can't hold this much power over me." But what Victoria didn't realize was that every call she made, every move she planned, was already being tracked. Her public relations team was activated within hours. Anonymous blogs began running stories. Disturbed teen obsessed with conspiracy theories. Dangerous boy seeking revenge for father's death. The plan was simple: paint him as unstable, discredit him, and turn the public against him. But Daniel was already 3 steps ahead. When the smear campaign launched, he responded not with denial, but with a video. Seated in a plain room, wearing his school uniform, he looked straight into the camera. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm 15 years old. My father, General Marcus Reeves, died 3 months ago while investigating corruption in military contracts." His tone was calm but firm. "You're going to hear people call me disturbed, obsessed, even dangerous. But remember, desperate people do desperate things. And the truth always finds the light." The video spread like wildfire. Within 6 hours, it had over 2 million views. Viewers saw not a crazed teenager but a composed young man taking on a billionaire. The narrative shifted instantly. David versus Goliath, a lone boy against the machine of power. Victoria watched helplessly as sympathy flooded toward him. Every attempt to smear him only made his story more compelling. "How is he doing this?" she shouted at her PR team. The answer came that evening in another envelope. Inside was a flash drive and a short note. 48 hours is now 24. Transfer or exposure. P.S. Your propaganda campaign only sped up my clock. Victoria's pulse raced as she plugged in the drive. The screen filled with evidence. Recordings of her discussing bribes with senators, emails authorizing defective equipment for combat zones, even photographs of her sitting with a man known in intelligence circles as the Fixer, the same man suspected of poisoning General Reeves. The photo was dated 2 days before the general's death. Victoria bolted from her chair, retching violently into a wastebasket. Daniel hadn't been bluffing. He never had. Minnie Hook. What she thought was a battle against a boy was, in truth, a war planned years in advance. The final mission of a general who refused to stay silent even from the grave. For months, Daniel and his father's men had been preparing. Surveillance, evidence gathering, digital backups spread across hidden servers. The truth wasn't just in Daniel's hands, it was everywhere, impossible to erase. Victoria now understood. She hadn't simply silenced a man. She had awakened an entire army loyal to him. And they had placed his son at the tip of the spear. 23 hours later, the countdown was almost over. Victoria sat in her penthouse, staring out at the city skyline she once owned. The empire she had built through cunning, power, and fear was unraveling, not at the hands of rivals, not by government regulators, but by a boy who carried his father's name like a weapon. Minnie Hook. The question wasn't whether Victoria Ashford would fall. The question was how, and how far the boy she underestimated was willing to push her. 23 hours and 50 minutes after Daniel's ultimatum, Victoria Ashford sat across from him in a neutral office space, the kind chosen for delicate negotiations. Her eyes were red from sleeplessness, her hand trembling as she signed the last of the transfer documents. 51% of DEFCON, her lawyer confirmed quietly. Transferred to the Veterans Trust. Victoria pushed the papers forward with a mix of rage and defeat. "This is extortion," she whispered for the 10th time. Across from her, Daniel leaned back, his gaze steady. "No, Ms. Ashford. This is restitution." Next to him sat Kenneth Morrison, the Pulitzer-winning journalist whose name had rattled Washington before. His laptop was open, his fingers poised above the keyboard. Victoria swallowed hard. "It's done. You win. Now give me the evidence." Daniel's lips curled into a smile, not the smile of a teenager, but of someone who had just executed a flawless operation. "The evidence? Ms. Ashford, this was never about keeping the truth quiet. It was about making sure it's heard the right way." Morrison turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a formatted article, headline bold and merciless. "The Billionaire Who Killed a General, How Victoria Ashford Profited from Soldiers' Blood." Victoria's stomach dropped. "You said, if I gave you the shares." Daniel cut her off coldly. "I said you had 48 hours. You wasted time trying to destroy me. You chose how you would fall." Rodriguez entered the room carrying a thick folder, dropping it onto the table with a heavy thud. Photos spilled across the surface. Victoria meeting with the fixer. Victoria slipping an envelope in a discreet cafe. Victoria receiving a burner phone. "We recorded everything," Rodriguez said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Parabolic microphones, directional cameras, GPS tracking. Military technology has its advantages." Victoria's face drained of color. You can't prove?" Rodriguez slid another photo across. "Here's proof you plan to eliminate Kenneth as well. A staged car accident, scheduled for tomorrow morning." Morrison's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "Too bad I don't work alone. If anything happens to me, 3 other journalists release everything instantly." Victoria pressed her hands to her temples. The walls were closing in. Minnie Hook. For the first time in decades, the woman who had crushed rivals with a phone call was utterly powerless. The empire she built was collapsing in front of her eyes, orchestrated by the son of the man she murdered. Across the river, in a modest Brooklyn apartment, Daniel Reeves sat surrounded by 3 glowing computer screens. At his side was Captain James Rodriguez, a seasoned veteran who had served under General Reeves for 2 decades. "She just hired Secure Trace Investigations," Rodriguez reported, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Same outfit that investigated your father's death and found nothing suspicious." Daniel nodded, scribbling in a notebook filled with connections, names, and patterns. "She'll try intimidation first. If that doesn't work, she'll move to elimination. That's her pattern." Rodriguez glanced at another screen. "We've located Thomas Chun, the accountant she used for laundering bribes. He's in Seattle. Willing to testify in exchange for immunity." A thin smile crept across Daniel's face. "Dad always said arrogant generals make one fatal mistake. They think they're fighting one enemy when they're actually surrounded." Minnie Hook. This wasn't a boy against a billionaire. It was a soldier's legacy, carried on by a son and fueled by a brotherhood of veterans who refused to let corruption win. The next morning Victoria arrived at her office to find an envelope sitting neatly on her desk. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry. Inside was a single photo, her leaving the building of her personal lawyer just an hour earlier. On the back, written in clean cursive, were the words, "Ms. Ashford, every move is seen, every call is heard. Step down while you can still choose how you fall." Victoria crushed the photo in her fist, but her hands were shaking. How could he know where she'd been so quickly? Right then her private investigator, Mitchell Barnes, called. "Ms. Ashford, I found something unsettling about the boy." "Tell me." "He's not alone. We've confirmed at least 12 veterans watching him, all former special forces. One is James Rodriguez, a cyber warfare expert who worked classified missions in the Middle East." Victoria froze. 12? That's just what we've identified. There are signs the network is bigger. This isn't a traumatized teen out for revenge. This is a coordinated military operation. General Reeves prepared him for this. Victoria hung up abruptly, her chest tight. If Daniel truly had a team of trained operatives shielding him, any attempt to silence him would be suicide. There was only one path left: destroy his reputation before he could destroy hers. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but razor-sharp. "Tomorrow at 6 a.m. this article goes live. At 7 the FBI gets the evidence. At 8, every senator you bribed receives a package of your financial records. And at 9, when the markets open, Ashford Industries will implode. Investors will flee, allies will abandon you, and you'll feel exactly what my father felt, watching everything he built be destroyed, powerless to stop it." Victoria's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face. "Please, I have a family." Daniel's voice didn't waver. "So did my father. The difference is your family will still be alive. Poor, humiliated, but alive. My father isn't coming back." The weight of his words silenced the room. Morrison closed the laptop. "It's time." Daniel stood, walking toward the door. But before he left, he turned back. His expression was calm, almost professorial. "There's a lesson here, Ms. Ashford. True power doesn't come from money or connections. It comes from integrity, strategy, and loyal allies. You had billions, but you were alone. I had only my father's memory, and an army of people willing to fight for the truth. That's why you lost." The door closed behind him. Victoria was left staring at the crumbling remains of an empire she had spent decades building, now reduced to ashes by a 15-year-old boy. Minnie Hook, the fall of Victoria Ashford wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning, proof that no amount of wealth could shield the corrupt when truth was armed with strategy. The next morning the headlines spread like wildfire. Every newspaper, every website, every television broadcast carried the story. Billionaire exposed for military corruption. Ashford Industries implodes amid scandal. Stocks plummeted. Investors demanded answers. Senators who had once taken her calls now denied ever knowing her. Victoria Ashford's name, once synonymous with power, was now tied to betrayal, greed, and death. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Reeves, a boy who had turned grief into justice and revenge into a legacy. Minnie Hook, but Daniel wasn't done. For him, this wasn't just about vengeance. It was about building something his father had always dreamed of, a future where no soldier's life was treated as disposable. 6 months later, Daniel Reeves turned 16. He was no longer the invisible orphan sitting alone at a diner table. He was now the director of the General Reeves Foundation, a billion-dollar fund dedicated to exposing military corruption and supporting veterans' families. The shares rested from DEFCON-financed state-of-the-art equipment for soldiers in the field. The veterans who had protected him now worked openly, investigating corruption, ensuring accountability. Victoria Ashford, once untouchable, sat in a federal prison cell, sentenced to 25 years for corruption, murder, and attempted murder. Kenneth Morrison published a series of investigative reports so thorough they won him a second Pulitzer Prize, tearing the lid off a network of fraud that had lasted 3 decades. And Daniel? Every week he visited his father's grave. Placing fresh flowers, he would whisper, "We did it, Dad. Not just justice for you but for every soldier who died because of their greed." The lesson was clear. True power didn't come from wealth or corruption. It came from integrity, strategy, and the loyalty of those who refused to bow to injustice. Minnie Hook, Victoria had billions. Daniel had only the memory of an honorable father. And yet, it was Daniel who stood victorious, turning tragedy into hope for thousands. The world had barely absorbed the shock of Victoria Ashford's downfall when whispers of Daniel Reeves began to spread. To the public, he was a 15-year-old who stood up to corruption. To those who had power, he was something far more dangerous. Proof that no secret was safe, no empire untouchable. For Victoria, prison was not the end. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Every day her name was dragged through the headlines. Journalists dissected her life, former allies testified against her, and business partners scrambled to distance themselves. What she had spent 30 years building was not just gone, it had turned to poison. Meanwhile, Daniel was stepping into a role no one imagined for a boy his age. The General Reeves Foundation quickly became a force. Veterans who had once fought beside his father now worked as investigators, auditors, and advisors. They poured their discipline and loyalty into Daniel's cause, uncovering contract fraud and equipment failures that had cost soldiers lives. Minnie Hook, for the first time in decades, the powerful weren't sleeping peacefully. They were watching the rise of a boy who carried not just evidence, but an army of the forgotten. But Daniel knew better than to celebrate too soon. Victoria had fallen, but corruption didn't end with her. DEFCON Industries still held deep connections inside Washington, and enemies with far-reaching influence had begun to notice the teenager who threatened their fortunes. One evening, Captain Rodriguez sat beside him, reviewing documents on glowing monitors. "You've rattled cages higher than you realize," he warned. Victoria was just one piece. "These people won't hesitate to fight back." Daniel nodded. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of someone far older. "That's why we don't wait. We strike first." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "You're 15, Daniel. Most kids your age are worried about exams, not dismantling billion-dollar networks." Daniel glanced at his father's photo hanging above the desk. "Dad didn't raise me to be most kids." Minnie Hook, it wasn't just revenge anymore. It was strategy, the continuation of a mission that had begun long before Daniel was born. Victoria tried to fight back even from behind bars. She reached out through old connections, lawyers, even loyalists who still owed her favors. But every attempt was crushed before it could gain traction. A week into her sentence, she received an envelope slid under her cell door. Inside was a photo, herself in the cafeteria line, tray in hand. On the back, "You are still being watched. Remember, my father always taught me to prepare for Plan B, C, and D." Her hands shook as she crumpled the paper. Even here, even caged, she wasn't beyond his reach. Minnie Hook, for Victoria, prison wasn't safety. It was a reminder that Daniel Reeves's eyes were everywhere, and his father's men had long memories. The public, meanwhile, couldn't get enough of the story. News channels ran specials about the teen who took down a titan. Talk shows invited analysts to speculate on how a boy had orchestrated such a precise operation. Some compared him to whistleblowers, others to historical figures who fought systems larger than themselves. Daniel ignored most of it. Fame wasn't his goal. Justice was. He spent hours combing through files his father had left behind. Encrypted folders, military audits, coded notes. Each discovery led to another trail, another hidden hand profiting off the blood of soldiers. "Every name we expose," Daniel told Morrison one night, "is another life saved. Another family spared what we went through." Morrison, hardened by years of exposing corruption, studied him carefully. "You realize, don't you? You're putting yourself in more danger than your father ever did." Daniel didn't flinch. "That's why he trained me." The veterans who supported him became more than guardians. They became mentors. They drilled him in strategy, encryption, self-defense, and negotiation. Each lesson was another layer of armor. To the world he still looked like a teenager. But those who met him knew different. Daniel Reeves was something rare, something prepared, something inevitable. Minnie Hook, and that was the most frightening part for his enemies. He wasn't just his father's son. He was his father's unfinished mission, given new life in a boy who refused to be broken. One night, Victoria sat in her cell listening to the news on a small radio. A headline pierced her like a knife. General Reeves Foundation exposes another $200 million fraud in military contracts. She turned pale. Every time Daniel made the news, her name resurfaced. Her downfall wasn't fading, it was spreading, pulling others down with her. She realized that her story was no longer her own. She was just the first domino. Daniel returned again and again to his father's grave. Placing fresh flowers, he spoke softly. "We're not done yet, Dad. But every step, every victory, it's for you." The wind rustled through the trees, and though he was alone, Daniel felt the weight of his father's presence. A general still guiding him from beyond. Minnie Hook. It was no longer about vengeance alone. It was about honoring a legacy. One soldier's fight carried on by a son too young to be feared, yet too prepared to be ignored. The world was learning a painful truth. Wealth could buy silence, politicians, even wars. But it couldn't buy loyalty. That belonged to men like Marcus Reeves and now to his son. And as Daniel stood taller, his enemies realized they had underestimated not just a boy, but a force trained to finish what a general had started. 16 candles glowed softly on a modest cake. Daniel Reeves sat surrounded not by classmates or neighbors, but by veterans, men and women who had once served under his father's command. These weren't just soldiers. They were family now, guardians who had chosen to honor Marcus Reeves by standing with his son. They sang softly, their voices carrying the weight of loyalty and memory. Daniel smiled faintly, blowing out the candles. His wish was unspoken but clear: justice, not only for his father but for every soldier betrayed by greed. This was not the birthday of an ordinary teenager. It was the quiet celebration of a boy who had changed the fate of giants. Minnie Hook. 15-year-old Daniel Reeves had toppled a billionaire. At 16 he was just beginning to build something even greater. In Washington, whispers of his name unsettled halls of power. Lobbyists muttered about the boy with the files. Executives avoided speaking his name in boardrooms. Even senators, once untouchable, grew nervous when his foundation announced new investigations. The General Reeves Foundation had become a storm, uncovering fraud, publishing reports, funding safer equipment for troops. The media hailed it as a new era of accountability. But for Daniel, the mission was personal. "This isn't about headlines," he reminded Rodriguez one evening. "It's about the families. No soldier should die because someone wanted an extra zero in their bank account." Rodriguez, battle-hardened and scarred, nodded with pride. "Your father would say the same thing. And he'd say you're doing it better than anyone could have imagined." Inside prison walls, Victoria Ashford watched helplessly as her name continued to haunt the news. She had thought prison would end the humiliation. Instead, every new revelation kept her tethered to the scandal. Her empire hadn't just collapsed, it had become a cautionary tale. Late at night, she lay awake replaying Daniel's words, "You created the very thing that will destroy you." She knew now that he was right. By silencing General Reeves, she had birthed something she couldn't control, a weapon of truth carried by his son. Minnie Hook, the billionaire, had fallen. But the greater truth was this: Daniel Reeves hadn't just ended her reign. He had lit a fire that would burn far beyond her prison walls. Kenneth Morrison's investigative series rolled out week by week, each piece more devastating than the last. He exposed networks of bribery, fraudulent contracts, and weapons testing scandals that spanned 3 decades. Senators resigned. Generals were questioned. Deals collapsed. The Pulitzer Board called his work a once-in-a-generation exposure of systemic corruption. But Morrison himself pointed to Daniel. "This isn't my story," he told reporters. "It's his." A boy armed with his father's lessons and unshakable courage. Daniel never chased the spotlight. When asked for interviews, he often declined. When pressed, he spoke simply, "My father died fighting for integrity. I'm just finishing his work." 6 months after Victoria's fall, Daniel stood once again at his father's grave. The grass was green, the flowers fresh, the air still. He placed his hand on the headstone, whispering, "We did it, Dad." Not just justice for you but for everyone they hurt. You're still leading us even now. A tear welled in his eye, but this time it wasn't born of pain. It was pride. Minnie Hook, it was never just about vengeance. It was about turning loss into legacy, pain into purpose, grief into hope for thousands. The true measure of victory wasn't in Victoria's imprisonment. It was in the families who no longer had to bury their loved ones because of faulty gear. It was in the veterans who now had a voice, funding, and purpose. It was in the growing army of truth Daniel Reeves had built, an army no money could buy, no power could silence. The lesson was undeniable. Victoria had billions, yet when her empire crumbled, she stood alone. Daniel had nothing but his father's memory, and with it he built something indestructible. True power didn't come from wealth. It came from integrity, from loyalty, from strategy. That was the inheritance of General Marcus Reeves. And now it was the weapon of his son. As Daniel walked away from the grave that evening, the city skyline stretched before him. He was still just 16, but in his heart he carried the discipline of a soldier, the mind of a strategist, and the fire of a son who refused to let his father's sacrifice fade into silence. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Minnie Hook, because when empires are built on lies, it doesn't take another billionaire to bring them down. Sometimes all it takes is one boy with the courage to fight for the truth. If this story moved you, if Daniel Reeves's fight for justice showed you that truth and courage can topple even the most powerful, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and be part of a community that believes in integrity, justice, and hope. Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on battlefields, they're fought in boardrooms, courtrooms, and the hearts of those who refuse to stay silent. And remember, true power never comes from money. It comes from standing up for what's right.